Chapter 33. Absence. Valet, help me! Valentina felt as frozen as the world around her. She couldn't take her eyes off the bloody footprints. They led straight to a body in the snow. It was Luca, her beloved big brother. Valentina might only be a girl, but this was not the first time she had seen a dead body. Her great-aunt Greta had died of the flu only 6 weeks ago. She remembered what the body had looked like at the funeral. On the outside, it looked like her Aunt Greta. The hair was the same. The age spots on her hands stood as a testament to a long life of hard work. The laugh lines around her eyes and mouth were as familiar as a happy memory. Even though Aunt Greta looked familiar, there was an emptiness to her body, like a vase without flowers or a shoe without a foot. There was a tangible absence to Aunt Greta's body. It was something Valentina detected as soon as she walked into the chapel. As she stared down at her brother's body, she sensed that same absence. The river without water, the clothesline without clothes. Blood trickled out of the side of his wool sweater. It wicked across the light gray fabric, creating a large ink blot on his back and side. The partisan patch, with its alpine star and edelweiss flowers, stood out in stark contrast on the shoulder of his sweater. It had only been a few hours since he'd strutted into the kitchen wearing the partisan patch. Their mother and grandmother had been terrified by the sight, but they cooed and told him how handsome he looked. They lied and told him how proud they were that he was going to fight for Italy. Luca had puffed up under their compliments, oblivious to the fear in their eyes. In her mind, Valentina kept hearing him say, "Maybe fighting Il Duce and his Nazi bastards will make a man out of me." "Valet, Luca is dead. I need your help." A tiny, powerful earthquake quivered from the top of Valentina's head to the heels of her feet. Luca was dead. He was an empty body. A memory of his big laugh and infectious smile floated just out of reach. "Valet?" Her chin jerked up. Marcello stood beside her brother's body. Snow covered his wide-brimmed hat. Flakes stuck to his cheeks and gathered on the buttons of his wool coat. His cheeks were flushed, as though he'd run hard and fast to get here. One of Il Duce's fascists got him. Marcello's eyes were wide and dilated in the darkness. A smear of blood marred his chin. More blood covered his knuckles. "I tried to help, but I wasn't fast enough." "A fascist?" Valentina hunched into her coat, eyes darting through the severe winter night. Blood smeared the side of Luca's head like he'd been punched. "There was only one of them. He must have seen the partisan patch." Marcello stared down at the brightly colored patch on Luca's shoulder. "The fascist ran away when he saw me. I didn't get a look at his face." Her eyes drifted to the bloody footprints in the snow. Luca's footprints. Marcello's bloody knuckles hung in her periphery like a nightmare. Grief, hard and sharp, knocked the breath out of her. She fell to her knees, sobs racking her. Hot tears dripped out of her eyes and fell steaming into the snow. They were swallowed up by the bloody puddle beneath her. She couldn't tell where her grief ended and Luca's lifeblood began. How could Luca be gone? What happened?" she gasped between sobs. "I told you. A fascist killed him. He was an idiot to wear that patch out in the open where everyone could see him." "How?" The question shivered in the air around her. How had one of Il Duce's fascists found and killed Luca? The bastard must have pushed him onto the rake. Marcello towed an upright rake that lay on the ground beside Luca. The tines steamed in the cold, each sharp end gleaming wet with her brother's blood. It was her father's rake. He left it out here sometimes, forgetting to put it into the shed. She crawled through the snow, not caring that her skirt and coat dragged in the puddle of his blood. Resting her forehead on his back, she cried. "It's supper time, Luca," she wailed into his scratchy gray sweater. "Luca, Mama sent me to fetch you for supper." "Valet," Marcello's voice penetrated her grief. A hand came down on her back. Marcello rubbed her between the shoulder blades. "Valet, we have to get his body inside. We can't leave him out here. Come on, help me." Sniffling, Valentina pried herself off of Luca's body. The blood soaking through the knees of her stockings was still warm. She pushed his shoulder and rolled his body over. The face that was revealed belonged to a memory she had done her best to forget. The neat black mustache Luca had grown a few months ago sat above lips painted bright red. The eyes, pinched with the pain of death, were rimmed with kohl. Cheeks marred with indentations from the snow were dusted with light pink rouge. When Nona awoke after a long night of fitful sleep, she immediately knew Dal, Lena, and Amanda had not returned during the night. There was an absence in the air that spoke volumes. She lay in bed, squeezing her eyes shut against the fear and grief that threatened to overtake her. She reminded herself that Nonna Cecchino was made of the toughest fibers. Tears were reserved for those rare moments when they really counted, not for moments of fear and potential loss. Resolved, she swung her feet to the cold floor and slid them into her slippers. "Stevenson," she barked, "get up. It's time to go practice." Nona might not be able to do anything for her grandchildren, but there was still one teenage boy she could help. She would do her damnedest to get him ready for this war. Chapter 34. A Brother Like You. Dal, Lena, and Amanda didn't come home that night. Their absence was like a yawning abyss. Stevenson didn't let himself look into the darkness. He couldn't. He couldn't imagine a world without Amanda in it. Amanda or Cassie. They were his best friends. What could have happened to them? They always took the truck to remote places in the middle of nowhere. They should have been safe. He wished Cassie were here. She would make him feel better. She had a practical side that always made Stevenson feel grounded. At least she was with Leo. He could tell from the way the other boy looked at her that he would lay down his life to keep her safe. It gave Stevenson a sense of comfort to know that at least Cassie was okay. "Stevenson, get up. It's time to go practice." Nona's voice filled the empty cabin. Stevenson latched onto it, glad to have something to distract him from a world that currently did not have Amanda in it. "Yes, Nona." He sat up in the bunk, hunching to keep from whacking his head. Changing into the clothes he'd worn yesterday, it wasn't like they had a lot of extra clothes in the Cecchino house, and besides, all the other boys were bigger than Stevenson. He paused as he automatically reached for his sneakers. He hated the shoes. They were ugly Nike knockoffs his mom had picked up for him at Payless Shoe Source. They were white and blue with red laces. So stark and ugly. Nothing like the Converse that sat in the dark recesses in the shadows beneath the bunk. Screw it. He grabbed the Converse. He wanted to wear them almost as much as he wanted Amanda to come home. If he couldn't have Amanda, he would wear the shoes. The thought of what she might say or do if she saw him in the shoes only solidified his resolve. Truth be told, the idea of his friend seeing him in those shoes was almost as uncomfortable as the thought of being seen naked. It was so uncomfortable that he became convinced he had to wear them, like his fear of being seen in them would magically make Amanda appear on the steps of the cabin. Resolute, he strode out into the main room. He braced himself for a comment from Nona. She was at the kitchen table, lathering slices of bread with jam. "Breakfast." She didn't look up as he approached. "We'll eat while we walk." There were 2 handkerchiefs on the table. Wrapping 2 slices of bread in the blue cloth square, she handed them to Stevenson. It wasn't until she rounded the table and headed for the front door that she noticed the shoes. Her steps slowed as she caught sight of the hot pink footwear. "About time," was all she said. He trailed her to the front door. "Where did you get them?" "They belonged to my daughter-in-law. She only wore them a few times before she died. They were too nice to send to the Goodwill." "And?" Stevenson dug deep. Honestly, if he wasn't worried sick about Amanda, he wouldn't have found the courage. "What about the other stuff?" Nona's mouth softened around the edges. "Also Christie's. Lena's mother was very fashionable." Something moved in her dark eyes. It struck Stevenson that Nona had outlived so many people that she loved. Her husband, her son, her daughter-in-law. She had to be worried sick about Leo, Anton, Lena, and Dal. "Nona, how are you doing?" The sliver of emotion he saw was immediately tamped down. The old woman who looked out at him was an impenetrable fortress. "I already told you." She turned on her heel, heading for the weapons rack. This time, instead of only grabbing the handgun with the silencer, she also picked up a Soviet machine gun. "We do not shed tears on possibility in this house. Get a machine gun. It's time for you to learn how to use one." "Right." Stevenson attempted to rally, turning his attention to the guns. The machine gun felt like a yoke as he lowered it around his neck, but he didn't complain. A heavy machine gun was a welcome distraction right now. He and Nona began the long hike to their shooting glade. Stevenson ate the bread as he walked. The silence between him and Nona was oppressive. He kept filling it with thoughts of bad things happening to Amanda. "What kind of jam is this?" he asked, in an attempt to distract both of them. "Sour cherry. It's really good. I've never heard of sour cherries." He may even have enjoyed it if his insides weren't tied up with worry. "We had them in the village where I grew up. It's a family recipe. I brought some cherry pits with me when I immigrated to America with my husband." "How old were you when you immigrated?" "It's not proper to ask a lady her age, Stevenson." "I didn't ask." "It was a very long time ago." Nona's voice was gruff as she hiked along in front of him. "A few years after the war ended." Stevenson tried to imagine being married and moving to another country. He couldn't get past the horrified vision of being married. His eyes skimmed over the top of his pink shoes. Yep, he most definitely wasn't marriage material. At least, not to a girl. This train of thought sent a ripple of unease through him. He dealt with it by trying to cram an entire piece of bread into his mouth. The result was messy and sticky. He did his best to clean himself up with the shirt sleeve. Thank God he wasn't wearing the pretty tank top. It would have been a shame to stain it with sour cherry jam. "Nona?" "Yes?" "How did you know I'd like the shoes?" He blurted out the words and braced himself for the answer. Nona was silent for a while. She walked for so long that he thought maybe she hadn't heard him. Just as he opened his mouth to ask a second time, she answered, "My brother was like you." "Like you?" The words echoed in Stevenson's head. My brother was like you. Hearing her say the words aloud was like a gong reverberating through his body. Nona knew. She knew he was different. Somehow, after knowing him for barely a week, she had ferreted out his deepest, darkest secret. This knowledge made Stevenson want to both weep in relief and bury his head in a hole. Of course she'd known. He was an idiot. Why else would she have given him the clothes and suggest he wear them? "What happened to your brother?" "He died in the war." "World War II?" "Yes." "How old was he?" 18. "What was his name?" "Luca Traione." Her voice was thick with emotion as she uttered the name. Only an idiot would miss it. Nona might be old, but the wound over her brother's death was still fresh. Stevenson knew he should shut up, but he couldn't stop himself. He'd never had anyone to talk to about this before. "Was he killed by Mussolini's supporters?" "That's the story, yes." "That's the story?" Stevenson frowned. What did that mean? "Yes, the family story." There was a weight to Nona's words. Stevenson felt them settle heavily around his shoulders, but he couldn't decipher their meaning. He attempted to prod the ambiguity. How did you know he was like me?" "He told me." Nona stopped in the middle of the trail and turned around to face him. She blinked wet eyes, but she spilled no tears. Patting Stevenson on the cheek, she said, "No more questions, Stevenson. You don't have to hide who you are around me." Chapter 35. Footprints. Valentina sat hunched in the corner of the kitchen, her knees pulled up to her chest. Her mother's wail filled the small, cold room. In a kitchen chair, her grandmother rocked back and forth, hugging herself in sorrow. Her father stared at the wall with red-rimmed eyes, drinking straight from a bottle of grappa. Marcello had gone to spread the word of what had happened to the other villagers. Valentina was lost in a haze of grief. She couldn't stop crying. She could hardly bear to look at her brother's body. Luca's form was stretched out on the kitchen table. He was covered in snow, dirt, and blood. Only his face was clean. Valentina and Marcello had made certain of that. It had been Marcello's idea. "Valet, do you have a handkerchief?" "Yes," her voice had quavered. "Give it to me." As Valentina handed over the handkerchief she always kept with her, Marcello pulled a flask out of his coat. She watched him pour the clear contents onto the handkerchief. Using it, he tried to clean the rouge off Luca's face. His attempt was clumsy. Valentina wordlessly took the handkerchief from Marcello. She barely registered what she did. The only thing she knew for certain was that her mother could never see Luca this way. She could never know the truth. It would break her even more than the sight of his dead body. After that, they had carried Luca's dead body back to the house. He'd been on the kitchen table ever since. Water dripped off his body as the snow melted. The wound in his side still seeped red. Valentina saw it drip off the side of the family table and onto the floor. "How?" Mama wailed. "How did this happen? There are no Mussolini fascists in this village." She hunched over the kitchen table, more sobs racking her body. "Vale, you say you saw nothing." Valentina recalled the scene with gut-wrenching clarity. The bloody footprints. Luca's footprints. There had been only one other set of prints there, and one set of bloody knuckles. Her mind had memorized the scene more perfectly than a photograph ever could. "Luca, Luca," she choked on her words. "Luca was already gone when I got there. Marcello found him first." "Even if we could find the killer, the authorities would hail him a hero," her father said dully. Technically, partisans were outlaws, even if support of them was strong among the villages. "There will be no justice for our boy." Her mother dissolved into a fresh round of weeping, wailing Luca's name over and over. Valentina remained huddled on the floor, eyes squeezed shut. She wished she could unsee the two sets of footprints, Luca's bloody prints and Marcello's clean ones. "Excellent!" Nona clapped from where she sat perched on a log. It was nearly midday. Stevenson had successfully hit no less than 5 large rocks that Nona had put out for him. "It's the shoes!" Stevenson grinned at her. There was a lightness in his eyes that was new. He was pleased with his performance with the machine gun, rightly so, but that wasn't the source of his lightheartedness. She understood where that light came from, even if he did not. She had seen that same light in Luca's eyes all those many years ago. It was the light of freedom, of authenticity. It made Nona want to weep with joy. But Nona Cecchino did not shed tears of joy. She was made of tougher stuff than that. "You think the shoes made you a better shot?" Nona smiled at him. "They're my magic shoes, like Dorothy's ruby slippers." That they were. She understood. There was power in not hiding from oneself. Maybe things would have gone differently for Luca if he had not been so desperate to hide from himself. "Maybe fighting El Duce and his Nazi bastards will make a man out of me." Even after all these years, those words still haunted her. "Are we going to take a lunch break?" Stevenson asked. "I want to see you hit those rocks 2 more times. Then you can take a lunch break." "Okay." He practically waltzed across the clearing to pick up the rocks he'd shot off the fallen log. His pink shoes were bright spots of cheer as he moved across the forest floor. They were the exact same color as the rouge Luca had used to color his cheeks. Chapter 36. Exposed. "You should keep the shoes on when the others come back." Nona's words were like an electrical shock to Stevenson's core. "What? No." It was late in the day. The two of them hiked back to the Cecchino cabin. Stevenson already regretted wearing the shoes. Surely Amanda, Dal, and Lena would be home by now. What if they saw him in the shoes? The very idea made him want to throw up. "You should keep the shoes on," Nona repeated. "But—" He struggled to find the right words. She had to know what the others would say. He would be ridiculed. They would hate him. They'd probably kick him out of the cabin and tell him never to come back. If they didn't kick the shit out of him on sight, just on principle of his wrongness. Stevenson defied logic and reason. He knew that. This feeling of wrongness he'd carried his entire life, the feeling of being born into the wrong body, wasn't normal. People didn't like people who weren't normal. Hell, his awkward, geeky nature alone had made him the target of bullies for his entire life. Dressing like a girl was unfathomable. Nona turned to face him in the trail. "The shoes make you powerful." So he wasn't the only one who had seen the transformation. To him, they felt like She-Ra's sword of protection, like the key to his safe transformation. But he wasn't a magical princess in a land of flying horses. He was a nerdy high school boy in a zombie war. He was positive the fantasy world of his little sister's cartoon didn't remotely correlate to the living hell they found themselves in. "The choice is up to you. I'll beat those boys with my wooden spoon if they even think of pestering you." With that, she turned and resumed their hike through the woods. Stevenson had a sick mental vision of little old Nona rescuing him from Leo and the others. Now that would be embarrassing. He couldn't actually imagine Leo and the guys hurting him, but he could imagine them hating him, despising him. He was already on the outside looking in. The idea of being even further outside the circle was inconceivable. No, the shoes would go back under the bed. Actually, he would take them off before they got to the cabin. He'd walk barefoot the rest of the way home so Amanda and the others wouldn't see him. They could never know. His secret would die with Nona. This resolution affected him in different ways. There was the customary relief that came with feeling safe. But lurking just beneath that was a deep sense of loss. Stevenson buried that second sensation, firmly shoving it down with an expertise developed over a lifetime. The loss hurt less than the penetrating fear that came with the thought of exposing his true nature. Maybe things would be different one day when he graduated from college and moved out on his own. Maybe it would be easier when he was an adult. He'd move to a big city like LA or San Francisco where he could blend in. Maybe then he could wear pink shoes without being laughed at or hated. Maybe— Nona froze ahead of him, holding up a hand to signal a stop. "Did you hear that?" "Hear what?" Stevenson strained his ears. All he heard were birds and the bugs. He realized the sound of the bugs didn't bother him today nearly as much as they had bothered him yesterday. "Voices. Do you think they're back?" Stevenson cupped his ears, eagerly craning his neck in the direction of the cabin. The thought of seeing Amanda filled him with relief. "I hear it. You're right. It's voices." "It's not our people," Nona said. "It's not coming from the cabin." She was right. The cabin was somewhere east of them. The voices came from the south. "Follow me." Nona hustled down the trail, moving at a good clip for an old lady. Stevenson scrambled to keep up with her. She ducked between a thick clump of manzanita trees. He followed her, snapping off twigs in his wake. On the other side of the thicket was a game trail. Stevenson realized he shouldn't be surprised that Nona knew it was here. This land was her home, after all. The game trail led south, snaking downhill through trees and shrubs. They stopped at an outcropping that overlooked the valley below. Between the trees, it was possible to see stretches of the two-lane highway. It was far below them, the steep hillside dizzying from the height. There were people down there, survivors, a group of them. Stevenson counted 13. They were on bikes, pedaling as fast as they could. Behind them was a pack of mutants. Only 4 of them, but from what Stevenson had heard from the others, 4 mutants was more than enough to take out a group of 13 unprepared people. The mutants loped down the road in hard pursuit of the cyclists. For the first time in his life, he had an instinctual reaction to help rather than hide. This feeling shocked him. It must be the shoes. But the mutants were too far away, and they moved too fast. He knew Leo and Anton and even Lena were good shots, but he didn't think any of them could shoot the mutants from this far away while they were moving. They had to be, half a mile away? "Think they can out-pedal the mutants?" Stevenson asked. "Maybe. Depends on their endurance." The cyclists took a hard turn around a 90-degree bend in the road. To Stevenson's horror, one of the riders lost control. The bike slid sideways across the asphalt and knocked into 2 other bikers. The riders behind them never even had a chance to brake. They ran straight into the pileup. In the blink of an eye, there was a pile of downed bikers in the middle of the road. Only 6 of them had escaped the disaster. One of them turned back to help his friends, but the rest kept riding. The mutants closed in fast. Nona grabbed the Soviet machine gun hanging around her neck. Before Stevenson could register her plan, she fired into the air. It took him a few seconds to catch up with her plan. But then he saw 2 of the mutants below them slow, turning to scan the tree-covered hillside. Then Stevenson understood. Heart-pounding, he grabbed his machine gun. Joining Nona, he fired into the air. He let loose a long, deep scream. The cry echoed across the valley with the staccato of his weapon. It was a very old scream, one that had been gathering in his belly for years. The scream was comprised of fear, a fear of others and a fear of self. So much fear, it was hard to comprehend. He threw back his head, letting it rage out of his body into the charged air. They were pretty much painting a big target over themselves with this stunt, but he didn't care. He didn't let up on the trigger. He didn't stop screaming. God, it felt good to scream. So damn good. Is this how She-Ra felt when she transformed into a warrior and beat back Hordak's evil horde? This thought brought a bark of laughter. Fictional cartoon characters didn't have feelings. Everyone knew that. Cassie and Amanda would laugh their asses off. For the first time in his life, he didn't feel like a wussy scaredy cat. He wanted to save those poor people down there. Cassie and Amanda would never believe this when he told them the story. It felt good to be doing something for the first time in his life. 2 of the mutants broke away from the road, disappearing into the trees that bordered the road. The last 2 mutants hit the pack of downed bikers. In the blink of an eye, 3 of the cyclists were dead on the ground, the mutants feeding on their brains. One of the riders fled into the trees. The others managed to get back onto their bikes and ride away, leaving their dead behind. Nona lowered her gun. Stevenson kept firing, kept screaming. Only when Nona rested a hand on his shoulder did he stop. He panted with emotion. Chest heaving, he reluctantly lowered the gun. He let loose 2 more long screams just for good measure. He felt like a lion, a fucking badass lion. He'd just risked his own life to save strangers. He'd just exposed himself to danger of the worst kind, and he was still alive, still breathing. At least for the moment. Eyes wide behind his glasses, he turned to Nona. Her mouth was set into a hard line. "They will be hunting for us," she said. "We have to get back to the cabin." Chapter 37. Memory. It had to be a mistake. Valentina was convinced. She'd made a mistake. In her grief, she'd misunderstood what she'd seen. It was nearing sunrise when she crept out of the house with her coat buttoned up to her chin. Papa was slumped on the kitchen table, head resting next to Luca's hand. Grandmother had fallen asleep in the kitchen chair, spent from grief. Mother had retreated into the bedroom and locked herself in there. Marcello had not yet returned. The snow had stopped falling. The pre-dawn air frosted before her with each exhalation. Long icicles hung from the eaves of the family home. More glistened from the bare branches of the trees. Valentina picked her way over the fresh, unmarred whiteness. Her boots made soft crunching sounds as she made her way back to the family shed. Just to the left of the herb bed were the fading footprints left by her and Marcello when they had carried Luca's dead body to the house. It was hard to believe that only a short while ago she'd come out here to fetch Luca for supper. She knew he snuck out to the shed to smoke cigarettes he stole from their father. She'd caught him at it more than once. Apparently, smoking wasn't the only thing he had done out behind the family shed. Tears pressed against the back of her eyes. Valentina blinked and sniffed, shoving down the wail that built in her throat. Breaking down would serve no purpose right now. The shed loomed before her. It was an ancient structure built by her grandfather Trione. It had withstood many winters. Her mother complained about it being an eyesore, but her grandmother wouldn't hear of rebuilding it. Carved into the front door was a faded, lopsided heart. Inside were the initials GT and JPT, Greta Trione and Jean-Paul Trione, her grandparents. Grandma Trione loved to tell the story of how her husband had proposed to her. He'd carved the heart into the shed door right after he finished building it, then invited his future wife over to admire his handiwork. When she saw the carving in the wood, he dropped to one knee and proposed to her. The heart carving was barely visible through the snow, but Valentina easily picked out the familiar shape. She used to dream about a boy carving her initials into a heart with his. But this very place where her grandparents' love blossomed had somehow transformed into the killing ground of her brother. How could deep love exist next to deep tragedy? It defied logic. Steeling her nerves, Valentina stepped around the shed. There was Luca's blood. It had turned into a frozen puddle obscured by snow. If a person didn't know what he was looking at, it would be easy to mistake it for a patch of frozen dirt. Valentina knelt on the ground and swept the snow away with her fingertips. She didn't want to let her brother's murder disappear under the snow. It wasn't right. Her eyes traced the frozen edges of the blood puddle. They traveled to the indentions that had been fresh footprints when she'd first found Luca. Those too were obscured by recent snowfall. But there were still spots of Luca's blood showing through. The bloody rake now lay face down in the ground, the bloody tines hidden in the snow. Someone had turned it over. The rake had killed Luca. Before tonight, it had been a benign object. Her family used it to rake the fall leaves and to till the garden bed soil in the spring. It was a tool, nothing else. But tonight, it had transformed into something else. She felt like she was seeing it for the first time. How could she ever have mistaken it for a simple household tool? The first rays of dawn turned the sky a dark gray, making it easier for her to see. Valentina felt her insides freeze. More than anything, she wanted to see 3 sets of footprints: Luca's, Marcello's, and the fascists'. She had prayed she had been mistaken, that she had been in too much shock to properly register the truth. But she hadn't made a mistake. The truth was plain before her. There were only 2 sets of footprints. They were exactly where she remembered them. 1 set bloody, 1 set plain. If she hadn't recalled them so clearly in her mind, it would be easy to imagine away what she was seeing. But the truth sat in front of her like a dagger through the heart. And there had been the blood on Marcello's hands, the blood on Luca's face where he'd been struck. Still kneeling on the ground beside Luca's frozen blood, Valentina hung her head. She wanted to disappear and cease to exist. Fresh tears gushed out of her eyes. She was helpless to hold them back. It wasn't every day you lost a beloved brother and a beloved cousin. Footsteps crunched in the snow behind her. "Valet, what are you doing out here?" Nona was out of breath by the time she and Stevenson made it back to the cabin. A long ache had settled into her back, making her clench her teeth against the discomfort. She was feeling her age. Nona Cecchino was not going to let a little back pain get her killed by mutant zombies. To hell with that. She fully intended to survive the mess she had gotten them into. She wasn't surprised by the empty dirt clearing that greeted them when they got back to the cabin. Dal, Lena, and Amanda had not yet returned. Now was not the time to dwell on what that meant, not now. She could grieve later, but not until she and Stevenson took care of the mutants on their way to the cabin. The first thing she did was fetch the old mare Lena and Dal had brought from Rossi. The animal would be zombie food if they left her out. She stashed the animal in the storage room with all the supplies and locked the door. "Think she'll be safe in there?" Stevenson asked. "What if they break down the door?" "It's the best we can do. Come on, we need the high ground." Nona marched up the porch steps, her shoes ringing on the wood stairs. Stevenson hustled after her. "What do you mean?" "I'm old. You're skinny. Neither of us stands a chance if the mutants catch us on the ground." "Are we going to make our stand on the porch?" Stevenson asked. "Nope. Higher. The trees? The roof." She glanced over her shoulder in time to see Stevenson's nod of understanding. "Grab a backpack, load it with weapons. I'll get food and supplies. You have 5 minutes." "5 minutes, okay." Stevenson dashed away. Nona saw determination in every line of his body and nodded to herself in satisfaction. He was transforming before her very eyes. His fear of the world was falling away as he released fear of himself. The sight of those pink shoes on his feet made her heart sing. She grabbed a spare backpack that hung on the peg by the door, distantly noting that it belonged to her son. Her mind skittered around the thought, not daring to get close enough to touch it. She missed her sweet Giuseppe every day. It was easier not to think of him, especially in times like this. She filled 2 canteens with water. On reflection, she grabbed a bottle of grappa and tossed it into the backpack. Then she changed her mind and switched out the grappa for the bottle of whiskey she kept hidden under the sink. Today definitely called for a few shots of whiskey. There was no telling how long it would take the mutants to find them, but she had no doubt they would come. She and Stevenson had called them as surely as a red cape called a bull, especially with all that screaming from Stevenson. She bustled around the kitchen, gathering up silverware and food. A leftover carton of chili went into the backpack, along with a half-eaten loaf of bread, a wedge of cheese, and some venison jerky. With the bag packed, she ducked into the girls' bunk room and grabbed extra clothes. It got cold outside at night. There was no telling how long she and Stevenson would have to wait for the mutants to find them. When she came back out, she didn't see Stevenson. On the floor by the front door was a backpack crammed full of magazines and their homemade bombs. He'd retrieved 2 additional machine guns from their supply in the basement. Good boy. He was using his head. Where was he? She was about to head into the boys' bunk room in search of him. Just as she did, Stevenson stepped out of the hallway. He had completely transformed. He had stripped off his dirty boy clothes. In its place was the woman's clothing she'd left for him. He looked like he'd been born in that pink tank and the black mesh top. The tapered jeans were a perfect fit on his lean frame. He looked better than he ever had in his boy clothes. Seeing her, Stevenson let out an unconscious laugh and ran his hands down the woman's clothing. Only a fool would have missed the reverence in his fingertips. If I'm going to die, I'm going to die as myself. His eyes were wild, yet there was a determination in the set of his jaw she'd never seen before. I'm tired of being so fucking scared every day. I don't want to be scared anymore. The words made Nona's heart sing, but it didn't stop her from delivering a whack to the side of his head. Language. They looked at each other. A beat passed before they both laughed. Nona affectionately tousled Stevenson's hair. Everything that had led her to this moment, to being with Stevenson in the middle of the Russian invasion and zombie apocalypse, was worth it. Every single thing. She'd do it all again just to see that light in his eyes. It was like looking up at her big brother after having a lifetime with the vacuum of his absence. Stevenson would never know how much she wanted to hug him right then. She hoped Luca looked down on her from heaven with a smile. Chapter 38. Waiting. The surge of recklessness Stevenson had experienced back in the cabin faded. He sat on the roof of the Giacchino cabin with Nona as the sun set behind the tree-covered hills, fiddling with the hem of the pink tank. What the hell had he been thinking? The adrenaline rush of helping those cyclists had made it hard to think straight. He'd felt on top of the world and simultaneously scared out of his mind. Putting on the clothes had felt like putting on armor to go to war, like drawing his sword of protection and transforming into a warrior princess who rode a flying unicorn. Only now it was getting cold, and fighting mutant zombies dressed like a girl was seeming weirder by the second. He tugged at the mesh top, wondering if he should risk sneaking back down into the cabin to change into sensible boy clothing. I brought you a jacket. Nona pulled one from a pile of blankets wadded on top of the roof. Stevenson took the heavy canvas jacket from her. Maybe I should go back downstairs and change my clothes? Nona's answering frown was fierce. "Why would you do that? It's not right." He tugged at the spaghetti strap, twirling it between his fingers. "I'm not right." Nona's frown deepened. "Says who? Everyone? Well, everyone out there is a bunch of idiots." "Not really," Stevenson sighed. "Thank you for being so nice to me. It means more than you'll ever know. But I'm not normal, Nona. I wasn't born right. You are exactly as God made you." Her words stirred emotions he had spent a lifetime suppressing. "Was your brother really killed by one of Mussolini's fascists?" He met her gaze, refusing to look away. Nona stared back. She didn't verbally answer him, but the look in her eyes was terrible. "I'm sorry. I shouldn't have asked. It's none of my business." Her bony shoulder sagged. "The war was hard on everyone." Stevenson shrugged into the big hunting jacket. He pulled his knees up to his chest, watching the first stars come out. "How long are we going to stay up here?" "Until the mutants come and we kill them." "Yeah, but how long are we going to wait?" "As long as it takes." Geez, this had seemed like a decent plan an hour ago. Now that he was faced with the coming of the night and sleeping on a roof, Stevenson wasn't so sure. What if he rolled off in the middle of the night? Heck, what if Nona didn't intend to let him sleep? He wasn't brave enough to voice any of these questions. If Nona said they had to stay up on the roof for 5 days, he would do it. He decided not to ask how to go to the bathroom until he couldn't hold it any longer. In Stevenson's mind, peeing in front of Nona Cecchino seemed akin to flag burning. Going number 2 wasn't even in the realm of possibility. He would hold it for a week if he had to. "Are you hungry?" Nona asked. "Yeah. I brought some chili." She fished around in her backpack, pulling out a carton and some spoons. "Here you go." He took the spoon she held out to him. She popped off the lid and scooped out a mouthful. It wasn't until she was on her 3rd scoop that he realized she expected him to eat out of the same carton with her. "Sort of feels like we're Lady and the Tramp." He shoved the spoonful into his mouth. "Only with chili instead of spaghetti, and I suppose we're both ladies. And there are zombies and communist bastards." There was a twinkle in her otherwise serious expression. "It's been a long time since anyone has called me lady." Stevenson snorted. Well, no one's ever called me that." Gosh, he loved Nona's chili. "If we die tonight, at least I have a belly full of your food. I swear you're the best cook I know." Nona snorted. "We're not going to die." "We might." She poked him in the shoulder. "My country would have been strangled by Nazis and Mussolini's fascists if we'd had that attitude." It struck Stevenson that Nona had experienced a lot in her lifetime. So much war and death. "What's worse?" he asked. "Soviets, zombies, or Nazis?" "Nazis spent years killing Jews and terrorizing Europe." Nona pursed her lips. "The zombies and Soviets haven't been at it for 2 weeks yet." He supposed that had been a dumb question. It was hard to believe it had been less than 2 weeks since the invasion. It felt like years. They ate in silence, watching the stars brighten as the night deepened. When the carton was nearly empty, Nona pushed it in his direction. "You finish it. A growing boy needs energy." He didn't argue. Using his fingers, he licked the bowl clean, not caring that he looked like a pig. Despite what Nona said, He knew there was a chance they might die tonight. He wasn't going to waste an ounce of Nona's chili. When he was done, he licked his fingers clean and returned the carton lid to the container. He noticed the orange lid belonged to the same Tupperware set his mother used. "My mom once told me that if I'd been born a girl, my name would have been Julie." "That's a nice name." "Julie Stevenson." He tasted the 5 syllables on his tongue. "I always secretly thought that should have been my real name. Only it would be Julie without an E. Juli. He spelled it out for emphasis. "That's what we'll call you. Julie without an E." Nona held out her hand. "My name is Valentina Giulietta Traione Cecchino. It's nice to meet you, Julie." Being addressed as Julie sent a shock wave through Stevenson's body. It felt like coming home after a lifetime of not even knowing he was lost. He blinked back tears, not wanting to fall apart on the cabin roof while they waited for mutant zombies to find them. Solemnly, he took Nona's hand and shook it. "It's nice to meet you, Valentina Giulietta Traione Cecchino." He swallowed. "Nona, you said before that you think God made me this way on purpose." "He did." Her expression was fierce. "God doesn't make mistakes." "But why?" He suppressed the urge to cry. "Why would God put a girl in a boy's body? It doesn't make any sense." Silence stretched. He hunched his shoulders, feeling stupid. He sounded whiny. Nona's brother was dead, presumably for being like Stevenson, though Nona hadn't said that outright. It was her silence on the subject that made him suspect he'd been killed for being different. "Do you want to know what I really think?" she asked. "Yes. Tell me, please." He scrunched his eyes shut, bracing himself for what she might say. She shocked him by laying a gentle hand on his cheek. With a soft pressure of her fingers, she forced him to look at her. "I think God sent you here to show the rest of us what it truly means to be brave, if you choose to accept his assignment." Her eyes took in all of him, from head to toe, from his thick glasses to his black mesh top to his tapered Jordache jeans to his pink Converse. She saw it all, and she smiled at him. And even though Stevenson was resolved not to fall apart, he burst into tears. Nona, the first person to have ever seen him for the person he was, put an arm around his shoulders and let him cry. Chapter 39. Attack. "Valet, what are you doing out here?" Marcello came around the side of the shed. He smelled of man-sweat, melted snow, and earth. His handsome face was smudged with dirt. Uneasiness made her want to bolt like a rabbit. Valentina forced herself to hold her ground. Marcello was nearly twice her size and definitely twice as strong. He could squash her like a bug and blame it on Mussolini's fascists. No one would know any better. "Valet?" She stared at him, refusing to be the first to speak. If he tried to grab her, she would scream so loud God and Jesus and all the holy angels in heaven would hear her. Silence stretched. Marcello swallowed. A hint of uneasiness crept into his eyes. His mouth hardened as he stared at her. "You knew!" The accusation in his voice was like a slap in the face. "You knew what your brother was." What your brother was. Her hackles went up. She glared at him, feeling less afraid with every passing second. "I saw it in your face," Marcello said. "You weren't surprised when you saw his face painted like a whore's." She squeezed her hands into fists. "You take that back," she hissed. His eyes narrowed. "Why should I? It's true. You take that back, Marcello Traione." "No." He took a menacing step in her direction. Fear beat in her chest. She dug her heels into the earth and refused to budge. "Murderer," she whispered. "I just wanted him to clean his face, but he kept telling me to get away. I pushed him and he fell on the rake. It wasn't my fault." "You said one of Mussolini's fascists killed him." He took another step in her direction. "I saved Luca from the Nazis. Do you have any idea what the Germans do to people like him? I saved him from a fate worse than death. They would have discovered his secret as soon as he stepped on the battlefield." She could hardly believe what she was hearing. "You didn't save Luca. You killed him." "No, you killed him." Marcello's words went straight to her heart. Without meaning to, she took a step back. Her elder cousin advanced on her. "You kept his secret. You should have told someone. We could have gotten him help." "Help?" She was incredulous. "What sort of help?" "Father Esposito would have known what to do. This is all your fault, Vele. It wouldn't have come to this if you hadn't kept his secret. What was I supposed to think when I saw him like that? It broke my heart, Vele. All I wanted to do was help him, but Luca didn't want my help. You should have helped him. It was your duty as his sister. We could have fixed him if you'd only said something." Valentina's world tilted dangerously. It was suddenly very hard to breathe. She bent over her knees, sucking in great lungfuls of cold air. Was Marcello right? Was Luca's blood on her hands? Had she really killed him by keeping a secret? He said war would make him into a man. He was supposed to go to war." Marcello crouched down in front of her so they were eye level. She wasn't sure if she was more terrified of her cousin or of the role she'd played in Luca's death. "I'll keep your secret, Vele, so long as you don't force my hand. Luca will be remembered as a hero. A village boy killed by one of Mussolini's fascists. That's a better fate than he could have hoped for. He was sick, Vele, a sick man. He would have brought shame to himself and the family. I saved our family from the shame that would have been brought to our name." Valentina was confused. Marcello talked circles around her. Could he be right? Could it be her fault that Luca was dead? The uncertainty left her feeling small and full of shame. Marcello straightened, once again towering over her. "Don't force my hand, Vele. Let Luca be remembered as a hero." He left her there, shivering and alone, in the snow. Stevenson didn't know it, but Nona held on to him like a lifeline. She'd helped Marcello cover up Luca's murder. Her entire life had been compiled around one big lie. By the time she was old enough to realize how he'd manipulated her, Luca was a village hero. She could never bring herself to smash the perfect pedestal her parents had built for her beloved big brother. When Giuseppe asked her to marry him, she hadn't been in love. He was 5 years older. His father, a wealthy merchant, had given him the money to immigrate and start a new life in America. The call of a life in a new country where she could escape the memories of Luca's murder was stronger than the need for love. Giuseppe had been a good man. She'd been lucky in that respect. He'd been good to her all her life, and she'd grown to love him deeply over the years. But not even a gentle life with a kind man could erase the shame of her childhood. Nona? Stevenson sniffled, head resting on her shoulder. Yes? Was your brother killed for being like me? His words tapped into a long-buried well of emotion. Yes. He wasn't really killed by fascists, was he? Nona felt her eyes grow wet. They kept doing that around Stevenson. He was killed by our cousin. I helped him cover it up. It was the first time she had ever uttered those words out loud. It felt like a great heavy darkness leaving her body. Her body shuddered from the exodus. We told everyone a fascist had done it. She didn't make excuses. There was no excuse for what she had done. How old were you when it happened? Stevenson asked. Very young. Just a kid. Nona sighed. Just a kid. My brother was barely 18. Same for my cousin. What happened to him? Your cousin, I mean. He joined the partisans shortly after Luca died. Came back a war hero. The entire village regaled in tales of Marcello's heroics in the war against the fascists and their Nazi allies. She supposed they could be true. Could 1,000 shiny deeds against the Nazis erase the darkest treachery? She'd long ago given up trying to answer that question. What do you think would have happened if Luca had shown up one day dressed like a girl? Stevenson asked. Nona had asked herself this question 1,000,000 times. There was only one answer. He would have been disowned by the family and condemned by the church if he didn't change his ways. You still think God didn't make a mistake? When he made me and your brother, he didn't mess up? Nona shook her head emphatically. Hate didn't end with World War II. It just mutated. People all over use hatred for a weapon. Maybe it's not Jews being killed, but people are still dying for no good reason. People are killed over religion, skin color, or just for being different like you. She gave him a squeeze, needing to hold him as much as Stevenson needed to be held. I believe God makes people like you and my Luca on purpose, she said, voice scratchy from a lifetime of buried sorrow. You are here to help us all change. We can lay down arms and find a new way to live together, or we can stay at war. It never occurred to me that I might be part of God's plan. He licked his lips. You really think my existence is part of something bigger? She could hear how much this idea impacted him. Of course. We are all part of God's plan. Some of us just have bigger roles to play than others. The trick, of course, was embracing your role in the divine plan. God did not always make things easy on his children. Luca never had a chance. Stevenson didn't ask any more questions after that. He remained with his head on Nona's shoulder. She kept her arm around him, the stars growing blurry as she fought back tears. Caught up in her memories, she didn't see the first mutant until it smacked into the rain gutter on the side of the house. Chapter 40. Apocalyptic Princess of Power. Stevenson jumped as the mutant slammed into the side of the Cicchino cabin. The monster latched onto the rain gutter, his roar vibrating across Stevenson's body. He froze in shock. Nona bolted into action. Rolling onto her knees, she snatched the machine gun that rested on the rooftop beside her. As the mutant scrambled into view, she fired. The mutant's head exploded. Nona was a killer shot, even in the dark. Stevenson recovered from his shock. "Move your butt, Princess of Power," he muttered. Scooping up his machine gun, he jumped to his feet. Growls materialized out of the darkness, drifting up around the cabin. With a sick sense of dread, Stevenson realized they were surrounded. They'd only seen 4 mutants on the road with the cyclists. "Does it sound like there are more than 4 down there?" he hissed. "Yes," Nona said. Oh, God. Stevenson gritted his teeth, hands tightening on his gun. He'd been an idiot to assume there had only been 4 mutants. Just because he had only seen 4 didn't mean there weren't more, as evidenced by the growling around them. If there ever was a time to transform into a princess of power, it was now. No more shrinking. If he wanted to live, it was time to fight. The Soviet machine gun in his arms might not be She-Ra's sword of protection, but it would do. "If I don't make it through the night, make sure my real name is carved onto the wall of Not Forgotten," he whispered. Nona's nostrils flared, her eyes narrowed. "There will be no need to carve any name on the wall of Not Forgotten. You are going to survive." He sure as hell hoped so. A mutant pounded loudly up the steps to the cabin porch and slammed into the cabin. Nona and Stevenson turned at the same time to see a pair of bloody hands curl around the edge of the roof. Defying every survival instinct, Stevenson shimmied down the sloped roof. He headed straight toward the emerging mutant as he fired. He kept his knees bent to counterbalance the angle of the shingles. The monster's head was out of sight, but one leg had found purchase on the ledge. Stevenson marched right to the edge and fired ruthlessly into the leg. Simultaneously, he stomped on the fingers of the mutant hand, daring to lean over the side of the roof. A snarling mutant zombie growled up at him, the face crisscrossed with infected veins. The mutant swiped, free hand closing around his ankle. Stevenson fired into his face. The mutant dropped, but the hand was still around his ankle. Stevenson went down, landing hard on the backside. He slid down the shingles, yelling as he dug his fingernails into the wood. Nona dove for him. Seeing the little old lady throw herself across the rooftop was almost as eerie as being dragged by a mutant zombie. She landed with a grunt, latching both hands around his waist. "Julie! Nona!" he flailed, not wanting to drag her over the side with him. The grip around his ankle slackened, the dead mutant sloughing away. Stevenson dangled half on, half off the side of the roof. Never in his life had he appreciated being a wiry beanpole. But as Nona heaved herself backwards, her nails digging into his wrist, Stevenson was glad for every bone that protruded from his skinny frame. If he'd been a big beefy guy like Bruce or Anton, it would have been impossible for Nona to drag him away from the edge. As it was, she couldn't do more than lug him up a mere 6 inches. But it was enough. That 6 inches gave him the balance he needed. Stevenson scrambled the rest of the way back just as 3 more mutants rushed up the porch steps. In their haste to get to him, they trampled the body of the one Stevenson had just killed. He got his feet beneath him just as the next mutant jumped and grabbed the roof. Thank God the Soviets put neck straps around their machine guns. Otherwise, he would have dropped it for sure when he fell. Stevenson snatched his gun and fired. The mutant hissed and fell out of sight, landing heavily on the porch below. "Nona, are you okay?" She was on her feet, eyes steely. "Takes more than that to finish me off." Inching down the roofline, she took aim with her machine gun. Another mutant jumped, both hands closing on shingles. Nona and Stevenson fired in unison. The mutant shrieked as bullets tore her hands to shreds. Stevenson and Nona stood side by side, a mere foot between them and the edge of the roof. They could just see the heads of the 3 mutants circling below. From the storage room, the frantic cries of the old mayor could be heard. His mind flashed to the last 2 days he'd spent with Nona in the forest clearing. He imagined the mutant heads in the center of the targets she'd drawn on the side of the rotting tree trunk. This is what she'd been preparing him for. Somehow, she'd foreseen this situation. He would make sure her efforts to keep his butt alive weren't wasted. Sighting on the first of the mutants, he fired. He let out a cry of triumph as his shots connected. The head exploded, and the mutant slumped to the porch, dead. Grinning, he glanced at Nona, only to jump when another mutant threw himself at the roof. This one had massive forearms and the neck of a professional wrestler. The distended muscles had torn his shirt sleeves to shreds. The black infected veins bulged as the zombie yanked himself onto the roof. The thing moved incredibly fast, dragging his torso onto the roof in one smooth move. Nona and Stevenson jumped back, both of them firing. Bullets sent up spurts of red, but the thing had his massive arms in front of his face. They caught the shots meant for his head. He kept coming for them, a leg appearing on the side of the roof as he pulled himself the rest of the way up. Nona's gun made an odd, clicking sound. "I'm jammed," she barked. "Keep firing." She hurried away to the munitions pile they had at the top of the roof. In a rush of fear and adrenaline, Stevenson dug in his heels and screamed. The mutant shifted into a crouch, but Stevenson refused to move. He couldn't let anything happen to Nona. A distant part of his mind marveled that he found the courage to hold his ground. Maybe the machine gun really was his magical sword. Just when he thought the mutant would launch himself across the distance, Stevenson got a clear shot at his face. Nona's target appeared around the mutant's head. "Die, asshole!" He fired until his gun clicked empty. The mutant tottered on the edge of the roof. Nona reappeared by his side, new gun in hand. She sent bullets into the mutant, sending him crashing over the edge. "Reload!" she barked at him. Stevenson scrambled to their supplies, snatching up 2 magazines. He shoved one into the gun and another into the waistline of his Jordache jeans. Holy hell, but he loved these pants. If he survived this battle, he promised himself he would never take them off. Something moved in his periphery. He looked up just in time to see a dark shape crawl onto the east side of the roof. It sprinted toward Nona with frightening speed. "Nona, look out!" He dropped to one knee, taking aim at the new mutant. How many of these darn things were out there? It was a woman, her body lumpy and misshapen from the virus mutation. He swept his barrel across the monster's legs, shooting her through the kneecaps. She fell to the roof but kept coming, dragging herself and her ruined legs across the shingles. "Julie!" Nona's shout cut through him. He glanced over his shoulder to see her taking on 2 more mutants as they crawled onto the roof. He sent a stream of bullets in the direction of the crawling mutant, this time sweeping her across the arms and face. She flopped around on the rooftop. She wasn't dead, but she wasn't moving very fast anymore. If he spent any more time trying to kill her, he could lose Nona. He turned his attention to the 2 threatening her. Sparks from the end of her machine gun illuminated her face. She was tiny, old, and wrinkled, but at that moment she was the fiercest thing Stevenson had ever seen. He adored her with every fiber of his soul. He jumped to her side. In silent agreement, they split their defense. Nona took the mutant on the left. Stevenson took the one on the right. Nona's mutant was the first to topple backwards off the roof. Stevenson's was seconds behind. As soon as that side of the roof was clear, he spun around. The female mutant was no more than 6 feet away. Blood gushed from her wounds, but she still came, dragging herself toward them. "Get her, Julie!" Stevenson braced the machine gun on his hip and advanced, firing as he went. The mutant screamed, throwing bleeding hands in front of her face. He didn't stop advancing until his pink Converse touched the widening pool of blood that spread from her body. She was finally dead, her body pulverized by bullets. He stopped firing, but there was screaming in his ears. Several seconds passed before he realized he was the one screaming. A hand came down on his shoulder. His scream dissolved into deep gulps. "We got them!" Nona's voice was full of pride. Stevenson spun around to face her. When she looked up at him, he felt like the person he really was, Julie Stevenson. For the second time that night, he burst into tears. Nona pulled him into a hug, patting him on the back while he cried. Julie did that." He waved a hand in the general direction of the dead female mutant. It was hard to believe he had killed mutants. And not just one. A lot of them. "Julie did that." Nona leaned back to look at him. Stars shone all around her head in the dark sky. Stevenson looked down at himself. From the pink Converse to the skin-tight Jordache jeans to the strappy tank to the black mesh shirt. The person in these clothes was not the same person he'd been 2 days ago. He was a new person, a person who could fight mutant zombies and survive. Tears still ran out of his eyes, but he threw back his head and laughed. He'd never felt this amazing in his entire life. He was Julie Stevenson. He was a fucking apocalyptic princess of power, and he was going to wear these clothes until they were threadbare and fell off his body. Chapter 41. Engines. At that moment, Nona Cecchino was convinced that Julie Stevenson was the most beautiful sight she had ever seen in her life. She just knew her brother's soul was looking down on her from heaven, clapping with pride. She had done right by Luca Traioni today. It had taken her a lifetime to make amends for what she'd done, but today she stood in absolution. She beamed at Julie, who stood beside her on the roof, laughing. Her head was thrown back, her arms outstretched as the night sky stood in silent witness to her transformation. Nona retrieved the bottle of whiskey she'd stashed in the backpack. Pulling out the stopper, she took a long swig. Then she passed the bottle to Julie. "Drink up," Nona said. "You deserve it." The girl threw her head back and drank. She almost immediately started coughing. Nona chuckled, returning the stopper to the bottle. "Let's get rid of this thing." Julie towed the dead female mutant on the roof. It took 2 of them to roll it over the side and onto the dirt below. "God, that thing was heavy," Julie said. "I think mutants might be heavier than regular people. Maybe it's the mutated muscles." "Maybe." As Nona took in the bullet holes that riddled the roof, she sighed inwardly. The cabin inside would be a disaster. There would be no sleeping tonight. "Think it's safe to go down now?" Julie asked. We made enough racket to bring mutants all the way from Bastapol, Nona replied. If there were more of them out there, they'd have shown themselves by now. They'd used a ladder to get onto the roof, but Nona had purposely kicked it over once they were up so the mutants couldn't use it. I'll go first and get the ladder for you, Julie said. Pride swelled in Nona's chest as she watched Julie grab the eave gutter and swing over the edge. Julie might not be the strongest in their group, but she had twice the strength of Stevenson. Watch out for the bodies. Nona counted no less than 4 mutant bodies on the porch. The blood was going to present a problem. The cabin deck was old, the wood faded and dry. Without a doubt, the blood would soak in and stain. When this was all over, Nona would make Leo repaint the wood. Dal and Anton, too. If they ever returned. Julie positioned the ladder beneath the roof. Nona lowered herself onto it, glad for her lifetime of hard work. She might be old, and she might not have the strength of her youth, but she wasn't a weakling. She stepped down onto the porch, careful to avoid the blood. We have to get rid of these bodies. Nona frowned down at them in disapproval. They had ruined her porch. Up close, she could see even more blood. There were not only big pools of it, but it had splattered everywhere. Her late husband had built this cabin with his own 2 hands. He would turn over in his grave if he saw it now, and they hadn't even been inside yet. What are we going to do with the bodies? Julie asked. Burn them? Nona shook her head. The smoke could draw attention to us. We'll need to bury them. Bury them? We're going to need a really big hole, Nona. They looked back and forth between them. They might be able to wield machine guns, but neither of them had the upper body strength to hack through tree roots and dig a hole large enough for all those bodies. We can get the boys to do it when they get back. Those 2 soldiers who went with Leo were strong, sturdy young men. Nona would put them to work when they returned from their mission to Luma. In the meantime, we just need to get the mutants away from the cabin. They're going to start stinking. Okay, I'm going to let the horse out. Then we can get these guys moved. Julie headed to the storage room. The old mare could be heard whinnying in distress. Nona stepped over a body and opened the front door. Even though she knew what awaited them, the sight of the destruction inside made her heart sink. Bullets had shot up everything. The furniture, food supplies, dishes and pots and pans. There was grit and dust and dirt everywhere. It was sheer dumb luck they hadn't accidentally shot the pile of homemade bombs sitting on the fireplace hearth. Nona pursed her lips. The Chiquino cabin wouldn't clean itself. Time to get to work. Outside, the mare burst from the storage room and bolted into the night. Poor thing. She hoped the animal didn't get herself eaten by a mountain lion or a coyote. The mare took out an entire wall of shelving, Julie reported. The storage room is a disaster zone. Like the rest of the cabin, then. Nona sighed. Grab an arm. She gestured to one of the mutant bodies. Let's get them off the porch. Nona ignored the puddle of blood surrounding the arm of the closest mutant. Blood would wash off her hands. Her porch was another matter. With Julie's help, they lugged the dead mutant across the deck. The body thumped loudly as they dragged it down the stairs. I wasn't wrong, Julie said. The mutant bodies are abnormally heavy. The body was no more than 5'8". The man turned mutant wasn't a waif, but he shouldn't have weighed more than 150 pounds. It felt like they were dragging a 200-pound man. He's heavier than he should be, Nona agreed. They paused as they finally got the thing to the bottom of the stairs. She prodded at the distended muscles of one leg. "Feel him. His muscles are dense." Julie grimaced, pushing at the leg muscle with her shoe. "He's solid. Maybe the muscles gain density as they grow. It would explain why they're so strong and fast." They resumed their task, stopping when they reached the edge of the clearing with the body. Julie panted from exertion, wiping sweat from the side of her face. "Do you want to start cleaning the inside, or do you want to move all the bodies first?" she asked. "Move all the bodies first." "Phew, thought you'd say that." Julie blew out a breath. "I'm secretly hoping some of our guys will return now so they can help us." She realized what she had said and squeezed Nona's arm. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean. I wouldn't complain if they showed up either." Now was not the time to break down over worry for her grandchildren. They had a cabin to clean and repair. It was a welcome distraction. It took them nearly 30 minutes to drag all the mutant bodies to a pile on the edge of the clearing. Nona was bone-weary, but she didn't let herself focus on that. She could rest after the inside of the cabin was spotless. "Nona, do you hear that?" Julie straightened, head tilted to one side. Nona's ears weren't as sharp as they'd once been, but she detected the sound. "Engines." "Yeah, more than one, I think." They moved in unison, hustling back to the porch. Their weapons sat in a tidy pile on the picnic table. As they grabbed machine guns, Nona mentally traced the sound of the engines. Someone was on their way up Pole Mountain. Her mouth went dry when she thought of Anton and Tate in the hands of the Soviets. If those poor idiot boys had managed to get themselves captured, she had no doubt they would be tortured until they gave up the location of Pole Mountain. The location could just as easily come from Mr. and Mrs. Craig. It was the very reason she'd been so determined to teach Julie how to shoot and defend herself. Hell, it was the reason she'd prodded her into the pink shoes and women's clothing. The girl had no hope of defending her life if she was afraid of herself. Only by embracing herself could she hope to make it out of this war alive. Even then, there was no guarantee. There was never any guarantees in life. "Trees," Nona said, voice low and urgent. She grabbed the backpack she'd packed for the rooftop. There wasn't much left in it, but there was a little food. Depending on how many Soviets were on their way here, they might have need of it if she and Julie had to make a run for it. Julie grabbed the pack with extra munitions, slung the extra machine guns around her neck, and hustled down the porch steps. She and Nona hurried into the tree line that surrounded the cabin, taking cover behind a big oak tree. "What's the plan?" Julie whispered. "If there's less than 5, we take them out," Nona replied. "Any more than that, we take the game trail and hightail it out of here." She didn't like their odds of traveling on foot in the dark, even with a well-worn trail, but it was their best means of escape. "Are you sure it's Russians?" Julie asked. "Who else would be bold enough to drive vehicles up here in the middle of the night?" "Good point." Nona rested her machine gun in the V of the tree, positioning herself so she had a good view of the clearing in front of the cabin. She would rather die than let the Soviets have it, but she had Julie to think about. 4 Soviets or less they could handle. Any more than that was too risky. Lights appeared in the darkness as the whine of the engines grew louder. There were at least 2 vehicles on their way to the cabin, possibly more, which likely meant there were more than 4 Soviets. It made sense. The snipers likely topped the Soviets' most wanted list. They wouldn't send a small force to commandeer the snipers' home base. Likely, they thought they'd find a full contingent of armed people here. Which begged the question of why they were making no effort to mask their approach. That didn't make sense. Nona frowned, wondering if she'd misjudged the situation. An ATV rolled into sight, the bright headlights throwing the rider into silhouette. It stopped beside the pile of mutant bodies, the engine switching off. "Holy shit!" a voice breathed. "What happened here?" The voice raised to a shout. "Nona! Nona! Stevenson, are you here? Nona!" The figure, still sheathed in darkness, ran toward the cabin as two other ATVs rolled into view. Nona's heart leaped into her throat. She knew that voice. She considered Dallas Granger to be one of her own, a grandson as surely as Anton and Leo. "Dallas!" Her throat, tight from tension, was scratchy. She swallowed to wet it and tried again. "Dallas! Where's Nona?" Lena's voice carried through the darkness. "Dal, where's Nona?" "I'm here." Grabbing her machine gun, Nona pushed through the forest. Julie fell into step beside her, juggling the 3 machine guns that dangled from her neck. "Lena, Dal, we're here." Julie put out an arm when Nona tripped on a rock. The two of them burst from the trees. Lena and Dal raced across the clearing, Amanda on their heels. They were filthy, looking as though they'd spent the last 2 days crawling on their hands and knees through the forest. Considering the fact that they were no longer in Giuseppe's truck, perhaps they had done those very things. They were covered with dirt and what looked like dried mud. They smelled like they'd rolled in a barn. Dal and Lena descended on Nona, enfolding her into a group hug. She grabbed them both, reminding herself that Nona Cecchino did not shed tears at reunions. This was a happy moment, not a time for tears. Tears were saved from moments that really counted. Beside them, Amanda and Julie were in a teary embrace of their own. "What happened to you?" Julie wailed. "I was so scared the Soviets had tracked you down and captured you." "What happened to me?" Amanda countered. "What the heck happened to you? There were 5 mutant bodies over there and you... What the heck are you wearing, Stevenson?" "This isn't Stevenson." Nona pulled herself away from Dal and Lena, planting herself beside Julie. "This is Julie Stevenson." Shocked silence followed this statement. Dal, Lena, and Amanda gaped at Julie. The skinny, awkward boy who had been afraid of his own shadow had transformed in the 2 days they'd been gone. The girl before them had no less than 3 Soviet machine guns around her neck. Her skin and clothing was smudged with dirt, grime, and blood. The 5 mutant bodies were testament to the fact that she'd fought to defend the Cecchino cabin. No one spoke. Julie swallowed, shifting back and forth between her feet. Nona saw fear creep into her eyes. "She saved my life," Nona said, breaking the awkward silence. Did you learn how to shoot?" Lena's wide eyes traveled up and down Julie's body. "You bet she did," Nona said. "We'll tell you about it over a cup of hot tea, and you can tell us what happened to you." Cleaning the cabin would have to wait. Integrating Julie was more important. She slid her arms through Dal's and Lena's, pulling them to the cabin steps. Amanda and Julie followed, leaning against one another. The awkward tension dissipated. It was a start. It would not be an easy road for Julie, but Nona was determined to do whatever she could to smooth out the bumps. Part 4. Family. Chapter 42. Grandson. They sat around the scarred kitchen table, drinking warm chamomile tea. Since it was nearly dawn, Nona and Julie whipped up some fresh biscuits. They didn't have ingredients for fresh gravy, but Nona kept a few instant packets tucked in the back of the cupboard. Not that she usually made gravy from a packet, but they'd been on sale. It was impossible to pass up a good bargain at the grocery store. Everyone was ravenous. They devoured a triple batch of biscuits, 2 packets of gravy, and half a jar of sour cherry jam. Amanda stared openly at Julie, but there was no hostility. Lena looked nonplussed, but attempted to address Julie and draw her into the conversation. Of the 3, Dal was the most uncomfortable. Nona saw him throw covert looks in Julie's direction, attempting to wrap his brain around her transformation. Nona kept the gravy flowing, knowing a good meal was a solid remedy for just about everything. Even the strangeness of a teenage boy turning into a teenage girl. The meal was a small step to help integrate Julie into the group. Over the meal, Amanda, Dal, and Lena shared all that had befallen them over the past 2 days. It was nothing short of a divine miracle they'd survived. The most disturbing part was their story of Soviets turning into high-functioning zombies. This was a new development. Nona had no doubt the war was taking a turn for the worse. Sentient zombies with a hunger for human brains could be nothing less than a full-scale disaster. "Your turn, Nona," Dal said, when he and the others had finished their story. "Tell us how there came to be 5 dead mutants outside, and how... Why?" His gaze jerked to Julie. Uneasiness stole through the room as all attention shifted to Julie. "You tell them." Nona patted her shoulder. "Tell them how we saved those cyclists and took out the mutants." Julie launched into the story. It was very different from the story Nona would have told. She wove a story about a cartoon warrior princess who rode a flying horse. She got very animated comparing her machine gun and pink Converse to a magical sword, which had the others laughing. The tension thinned as chuckles flowed. Nona did her best to follow the story, but she was distracted by the bullet holes embedded in the old family table. In her mind, she worked out how best to get rid of them. Wood putty and a little wood stain would do the trick. The table might be old and beaten from years of use, but no way on God's green earth was she going to have Soviet bullet holes staring back at her for however many years she had left in this world. "Thanks for looking after Nona," Dal said when Julie finished the story. "I'm glad you've gotten comfortable with a gun." Julie shook her head, smiling affectionately at Nona. "Nona looked after me." "We looked after each other," Nona corrected. "Any word from Anton or Leo?" Lena asked. Julie flicked a glance at Nona before shaking her head. "No word from either of them." Fatigue hit Nona with the force of a freight train. As she swallowed the last of her chamomile tea, she felt her age. 10 years ago, she would have bustled everyone into action in the early dawn hours and cleaned the cabin from top to bottom. She always could work harder and longer than everyone else in the family. But soreness was beginning to set in. Her body ached from the rooftop battle. It was the dive she'd taken across the roof to save Julie. That maneuver was for someone 20 years younger. She wasn't the only one who was exhausted. Lena looked like she was half asleep on Dal's shoulder. Amanda kept blinking and rubbing her eyes. The cabin could be cleaned as easily later as it could be now. As much as it irritated her to admit it, Sleep was more important now. "Let's get some sleep." She rose from the table, collecting a pile of plates. "Everyone can have a 3-minute shower." Since their water heater was powered by propane, hot showers were highly allocated. But they'd all earned a hot shower today, herself included. "Really?" Lena sat up, eyes rounding as she looked at Nona. "I figured you'd want to clean this place up till it was spotless." "Oh, I do," Nona replied. "And we will, after a hot shower and some sleep." It was the sound of water hissing through the pipes that woke Nona from a deep, dreamless sleep. She sat up, listening. Someone was in the shower. She heard water hitting the tile walls. A glance at the window told her it had to be near noon. Everyone in the cabin had showered after breakfast, so who was in the shower? Her heart leaped into her throat. Grabbing her bathrobe, she got out of bed. Her body protested, but she ignored it and rushed into the main room. Anton stood beside the coffee maker, his back to her. He wore nothing but a pair of bloody, filth-encrusted fatigue pants. Even from across the room, Nona detected the scent of piss clinging to him. His feet were bare. He wore no shirt. Nona froze mid-step, her eyes tracing the wounds on her grandson's back. Her eyes might not be what they used to be, but she knew cigarette burns when she saw them. Alongside them were bruises, cuts, and scrapes. She must have made a sound because Anton turned. Her throat constricted at the sight of him. The boy who stood before her wasn't Anton, at least not the Anthony Cecchino who had snuck away from the cabin with his friend on an impulsive, pointless mission. The Anton who stood before her was almost a stranger. It wasn't the cigarette burns on his face, neck, chest, and rib cage that made her heart nearly stop. It wasn't the Soviet insignia that had been carved onto his chest with a knife either. It wasn't even the bruises that covered every square inch of his body that broke her heart. It was his eyes. The eyes that stared out at her from her grandson's face were the eyes of a young man she was meeting for the first time. They were flat, humorless, and vacant. He looked at her, face as expressionless as his eyes. It took all of Nona's willpower not to break down at the sight of him. But she had not survived World War II because she was weak. Nona was strong. She had always prided herself on that. Even when she buried her brother and covered up the facts around his death, she knew she had the strength to continue living. She would not cry for her grandson. He deserved better than that. It was clear he had gone through hell to make it back here. His body said he had been captured and tortured. By some miracle of God, he had escaped and survived. She would not disgrace his strength by bursting into tears. "Surprise." He made an attempt to smile, failed, and resumed looking at her. "Bet you never thought you'd see me again." She didn't ask about the Craigs. Their absence was enough. If they were still alive, they would be here. Tate must be in the shower. She could hardly comprehend what she might see when he came out. "I've been waiting for you, Anthony. You missed breakfast." "Sorry I'm late, Nona." The bloody carving of the Soviet insignia on his chest blared out at her. The sight of it threatened to buckle her knees. The blistered lumps of cigarette burns on his jaw, neck, and body told a story she wasn't sure she wanted to hear. The rank smell of piss was stronger than ever. "I'll make lunch for you boys. A nice venison pasta is just what you need." She bustled across the room to her pantry. looking at the neat row of homemade spaghetti sauce, gave her a moment to stuff down the wail of despair that wanted to burst from her throat. She would not cry for her grandson. No matter what, she would not cry. "You're going to need me to look at those wounds." She turned around, jar in hand, and forced herself to survey his body with a critical eye. "Those communist bastards were not kind to you." "No, they weren't." Anton looked down at himself. Not nice at all. The bathroom door opened. Footsteps sounded in the hall. Nona turned, bracing herself for the sight of Tate Craig, but Anton moved to block her view. "Wait a second, Kaz," he called. To Nona he said, "There's someone I need you to meet, Nona. Where's your rifle?" She narrowed her eyes at her grandson. "Right here." She hefted it from where it rested next to the pantry. "Give it to me for a sec." No. If he wanted her to put her rifle aside, it was because there was likely something that needed shooting. "What's going on, Anthony?" "I need you to meet someone. Just don't shoot him, okay?" She waited without responding, uneasiness mounting in her chest. Anton's mouth tightened, but he didn't try and sway her again. He knew better. "Kaz, you can come out." Out of the hallway stepped the largest man Nona had ever seen in her life. He had bushy, gray-streaked hair and a beard that was mostly white. One of his arms was easily 3 times the size of her leg. He was the equivalent to the size of 3 full-grown men. The sight of him made every square inch of her body tingle with alertness. It didn't take a genius to know he was Russian. No wonder Anton had asked her to put her rifle down. She was inclined to use it on the spot. "Where's Tate?" "He's dead." She hadn't thought it was possible for Anton to look any more empty. She'd been wrong. At the mention of Tate's name, Anton's expression seemed to fold in on itself. His eyes glazed over. He looked like he was someplace else. "The Craigs are all dead. The whole family. This is Kozlovovich." Anton flicked a glance at the towering man. "You can call him Kaz. He's the reason I'm standing here. He's an invader." Shooting this man in the head was not beyond the realm of possibility. "He helped me escape." Anton didn't elaborate on what had needed escaping. Nona didn't need to hear the details to understand them. It was obvious he had been tortured meticulously and mercilessly, and the Craigs had all been murdered by Russian scum. She hardened herself and kept her spine straight. She was proud of Anton. He was a fighter, a warrior. Only true inner strength could have enabled him to survive a KGB torture chamber. "Thank you for helping my grandson escape," Nona said at last. "What is it you want in return?" Did the beastly man even speak English? "He needs our help, Nona," she harumphed. "Anton brings a Soviet into her home and proposes their family help him?" It was almost too much for her to take. "Go take a shower," she told Anton. "I will make lunch." She glared at the Russian. "He may sit at my table, but I won't hesitate to shoot him. You tell him that." 2 days ago, Anton would have laughed at this statement. Today, he just nodded. "Okay, he speaks a little English. Kaz, have a seat. The coffee is almost ready. My grandma is a good shot." "Thank you." The big man's voice rumbled through the room. The sound of it put up Nona's hackles. She slammed a pot down on the counter. Studiously ignoring the monster who took a seat at her table, she set about preparing a simple pasta with venison sauce. "Anthony." Her grandson paused in the hallway, glancing back at her. Wait for me in the bunk room when you're finished. I'll see to your wounds. Okay, Nona. The pipes whined as the shower turned on. Nona gripped the edge of her tile countertop, taking a moment to gather herself. Voices sounded from the bunk rooms. Lena rushed into the sitting room, still clad in her pajamas. Anton? Leo? Nona, I heard voices. Are they back? Lena stopped short at the sight of Cause, mouth falling open. The big man sat with his hands folded on the tabletop. He looked like he was trying to make himself inconspicuous. Everyone knew it was impossible for a bear to make itself inconspicuous. Anton is back. Nona snapped on the stovetop. He brought a friend. Oh. Lena stared openly at the Russian. He studied the tabletop, not uttering a word. What the heck? Amanda, Dal, and Julie piled into the room behind Lena. They all gaped at the big man in a stained white lab coat. Julie, once again dressed in women's clothing, was no longer the most interesting person in the cabin. Sit, Nona ordered. I'm making lunch. Is he Russian? Julie asked. I am Russian, Kaz said. Everyone jumped at the sound of his deep rumble. Lena spoke, rattling off a string of Russian words. It was Kaz's turn to blink in surprise. He responded to Lena. They exchanged a few words as Lena and the others took a seat. Nona felt her temper getting the better of her. The Soviets had murdered her son. They had tortured her grandson and killed the Craig family. Now, one of them sat at her table, talking to her granddaughter. She couldn't take it anymore. Lena! Nona may have put the plates down on the table more heavily than necessary. Set the table. Julie, get the colander out. Dal, we need another load of firewood. I'll help Lena. Amanda practically flew to the silverware drawer. With everyone bustling around her, Nona felt her nerves calm. She dropped a fistful of noodles into boiling water. Chapter 43. Mirror. Anton was too exhausted and aching to stand in the shower. He sat on the floor under the hot stream of water, eyes closed as water washed away the filth. He rested his forehead on his knees, silently crying. He tried to suppress the tears, but it was no use. Confronting his grandmother in the kitchen had been one of the hardest moments of his life. He was a failure. He'd ridden off with Tate, intent on saving Mr. and Mrs. Craig. Not only had he failed to save their family friends, but he'd lost Tate in the process. Nona hadn't said a word about the Craigs, but he'd seen the moment when the shock of their deaths hit her. He'd seen the pain in her eyes. It was almost enough to make him wish he was dead. Anton Cecchino was a failure, pure and simple. He'd set out on a mission and failed everyone he cared about. He saw Tate's dead body on the floor of the prison cell. He saw Mr. and Mrs. Craig, both of them executed like they were nothing more than garbage. He saw them die over and over and over again. It was a reel of the worst moment of his life. Try as he might, he couldn't shut off the projector. His body shook as he sucked in great gulps of air, trying to get his panic under control. The stench of cigarette smoke was strong. Even under the clear stream of water, he smelled the agent's smoke. He felt it enter his lungs and choke him. That KGB fuckhead might be dead, but Anton knew he'd carry that asshole with him for the rest of his life. He probed at the cigarette burns, wincing at the pain. His hand slid down to his rib cage, where the pain was worst. Not for the first time, he wondered if he had cracked ribs. How did someone heal a cracked rib? It wasn't like he could get a body cast. Did they even give people body casts for cracked ribs? He didn't think so. Leo had mentioned one of his teammates cracking a rib in a particularly brutal football game. The guy had been benched for half the season, but he hadn't worn a body cast. He stabbed the tender rib. Pain spidered up his body. Impulsively, he stabbed several of the cigarette burns, welcoming the pain. It was easier to block out memories of the Craigs when he was in pain. What Anton really wanted to do was curl into a ball and fall asleep under the warm water. He could just imagine what Nona would say to that. "Does propane grow on trees, Antony? What will we do now that you've wasted our entire tank?" He forced himself to his knees. Grabbing a bar of soap, he scrubbed his body. He was ruthless with the cuts, especially those that had been carved into his chest. The soap stung, but it felt good. Blood trickled down his body as scabs softened under his rough hand. The red mingled with the steaming water and disappeared down the drain in pink swirls. Switching off the water, his hand hesitated over the cheery yellow towels stacked on the back of the toilet. His mother had bought those towels before she died. No one had wanted to change them out for new ones, even though the edges were frayed and there were small holes in all of them. They were a memory of a happier time when the Cecchino family had been intact. The blood would stain them. Anton couldn't stand the thought of staining one of his mother's towels. Dripping wet, he stepped out of the shower. Every step sent a shock wave of pain through his body. He ignored it, crouching down to open the cabinet under the sink. Tucked inside was a stack of dark brown towels. Nona had purchased those, declaring that sometimes hunters were just too dirty to use yellow towels. Anton took one of them, dabbing at the trickle of blood that ran from the carving in his chest. Pushing back into an upright position felt like an Olympic feat. His leg muscles protested. Bruises had surfaced all over them, presents from the Russian scumbags. Slowly, he toweled himself dry. The mirror was fogged from the shower steam. Moving automatically, he swiped the towel across the surface. The white fog was cleared away, revealing his face. Anton wasn't prepared for the shock of it. Through the small beads of perspiration that remained on the surface of the mirror, he saw the swollen face of a teenage boy. There were bruises on top of bruises, cuts on top of cuts. All the goddamn cigarette burns were red and blistered. The sight brought the Russian prison cell crashing back in around him. Tate, Mrs. Craig, Mr. Craig. The crack of gunshots, and his friends were executed. The memory exploded in his ears like fireworks. He gagged on the stench of cigarette smoke, even though all he could smell was the steamy remains of the shower. It took every ounce of willpower not to punch the mirror with his fist. Nona would not approve if he destroyed the mirror. She would not approve at all. Her cabin had already been destroyed by mutants. She didn't need her fucked-up grandson adding to the mess. He gripped the edges of the sink, sweat breaking out along his back and brow. His heart beat painfully in his chest. He sank to the floor, struggling to breathe. Was he having a heart attack? He hoped so. Dying here in the bathroom of the beloved family cabin was a good way to go. His chest heaved as he sucked in great gulps of air, fighting silently against the panic that threatened to choke him. When it was finally over, he slumped against the bathroom door, even more exhausted than he had already been. Maybe he really would go to sleep in the middle of the floor. Pull your shit together, he berated himself. Stop being a pussy. Gripping the edge of the sink, he dragged himself to his feet. He forced himself to face the boy in the mirror. He'd stared at the boy made in the KGB torture chamber, daring himself to meet him. No one would ever again call him good-looking. The cigarette scars would see to that. Only time would tell how the rest of his face would heal. He realized he didn't give a fuck how he looked. What did it matter anyway? Being a pretty boy had never counted for much. It had never been enough to get him the things he really wanted. They hadn't handed him a pretty girlfriend. They hadn't helped him throw the football. They sure as fuck hadn't helped him survive Russian torture. He had Kozlovovich to thank for that. Finding the big man, or rather being found by him, was like getting the winning lottery ticket. Not only had Koz saved his life, but he'd shared a lot of information on their ride from Rossi. The big man just might be able to turn the tide of this war if Anton could get him alive to the right people. If Anton wanted to see the Russians royally fucked, Koz was the key. Anton had to survive, if only to get Koz and his information to what remained of the American military. Purpose. Mission. It would be enough. He would survive, and he would see the Russian scum get their asses handed to them. Wrapping the towel around his waist, he opened the bathroom door and walked slowly to the boys' bunk room. The Soviet fatigue pants, a twisted souvenir from his trip to Rossi, remained on the floor in a stinking pile. Chapter 44. Toughest Girl in the Village. Nona was just setting the pot of pasta sauce on the kitchen table when she heard the bathroom door open. She glanced up and saw Anton limp into the bunk room, a dark towel around his waist. "Eat," she ordered, setting a second pot, this one with freshly cooked noodles, on the table. Leaving everyone to dig into the afternoon meal, Nona headed over to the row of backpacks hanging on hooks by the door. She grabbed her son's backpack, which hung heavy from the weight of the whiskey bottle. The first aid kit was also inside, still there from last night. Steeling herself, Nona marched into the boys' bunk room. Anton sat on the edge of a bed, buttoning up a clean pair of jeans. If possible, he looked even worse now that he had showered. The clean skin made the wounds stand out. At least the smell of piss was gone. "Where are your dirty pants?" she asked. "I forgot them in the bathroom." "I want you to throw them out with the mutant bodies. We'll bury them." "Yes, Nona." She sat on the bed next to him and pulled out the bottle of whiskey. Removing the stopper, she took 2 long swigs. It was a good delay tactic. It was a good way to steel her nerves for tending her grandson's wrecked body. Wordlessly, she handed the bottle to Anton. He took it without question. Tilting his head back, he took 3 long swallows. "I didn't know you kept whiskey around the cabin." Anton handed the bottle back to her. "That's because I kept it hidden." Nona returned the stopper and pulled the first aid kit out of the backpack. "Let me get a good look at you, Anthony." He turned so that his back was to her, letting her see the wounds there. Truth be told, she would almost rather gouge out her eyes than look at the atrocities done to her grandson. She forced herself to look anyway. Hiding would serve no purpose. She missed her son every day. For the first time, she felt relief Giuseppe wasn't alive to see what had been done to his son. Her Giuseppe was a kind-hearted man. This would have shattered his soul. First came the peroxide. She applied liberal amounts to cotton balls and went for the cuts. Anton didn't make a sound as she cleaned and disinfected the wounds. "How are your ribs?" She prodded several of the darker bruises on his torso. He flinched. "Oh, hurts." "You might have cracked ribs." "I figured. What can I do?" "They'll heal on their own," she replied. "You just have to take it easy." Anton snorted at that. Nona understood. It was hard to take it easy when they were at war. "Try not to twist too much or lift anything that's heavy," she said. "Make sure you take deep breaths even if it hurts. That will keep pneumonia from setting in." "You can get pneumonia from cracked ribs?" "You certainly can, young man. My great-uncle got pneumonia after falling out of a tree and cracking his ribs." "He survives the KGB only to die of pneumonia," Anton muttered. "You are a Chekino," Nona told him. "You are not going to die of pneumonia. You are a survivor, Antony. Don't you dare forget it." He didn't respond. Nona finished cleaning and disinfecting his back. When she was finished, she said a small prayer, asking God to give her strength for what she knew was coming. She was about to face the worst of Anton's wounds head on. "Let me see your other side now, Antony." He obediently turned around. She found herself staring into his vacant eyes. A deep grief shivered through her. Nona felt cold all the way down to her bones. It was like standing in the winter snow back in her village. "You're the toughest girl in the village." Luca's voice drifted through her mind. She could practically smell the fresh snow on the ground, even though it had been several decades since she'd last stood in snow. She was tough. Luca was right about that. Nona Chekino would not weep over the sight of her grandson. She clenched her jaw, focusing her attention on the carving on his chest. A weaker woman would have fallen to pieces. Nona merely studied the knife wounds. "I think it's too late for stitches. They're already beginning to scab." "I don't need stitches." Nona rubbed antibiotic cream on the knife wound and covered the abomination with gauze and a bandage. Next, her attention went to the cigarette burns. Using the antiseptic cream, she applied it to the little burn marks all over his body. He had them on his jaw, neck, rib cage, and back. Anton's handsome face would never be the same. Setting aside the antiseptic tube, Nona regarded her grandson. "Did you kill the ones who did this to you?" she asked quietly. "I wasn't the one to kill him, but he's dead." "As long as he's dead." Unable to help herself, she rested one hand against his cheek, the one untouched by cigarette burns. "I'm glad you're home, Antony." He stared back at her in vacant silence. "My brother once told me that strength is up here." Nona gently tapped Anton's forehead. "You are strong, Antony. You are one of the strongest boys I know." "Your brother? The one killed by Mussolini's supporters in the war?" "He wasn't killed by a fascist. That was a lie told by me and my cousin." The truth sprang free of her, words that had been trapped inside her body for far too long. Never again would she spread the lies surrounding Luca's death. "You lied about your brother's death?" A dent appeared in Anton's brow. It was the first facial expression she had seen since he'd returned home. "Yes, my cousin killed your great-uncle, and I helped him cover it up." "But why?" Nona sighed. My brother was like Julie. It got him killed." "Who?" Anton hadn't yet met Julie. Nona clarified. "My brother was like Stevenson." This was adequate explanation for Anton. He nodded in understanding, not questioning her further about Julie. "But why did you cover it up if your cousin murdered him?" Nona met Anton's eyes. "Because I was a scared little girl and I didn't know better." She rested her hand on top of her grandson's. "War makes us all grow up faster than we should, Antony." Chapter 45. Microscope. When Nona finished with Anton, he buttoned on a clean flannel shirt. All his wounds were hidden except for the cigarette burns on his neck and jaw and the cuts and bruises on his face. Even that was enough to suck the oxygen out of the room as he walked slowly into the kitchen. He appeared to be limping on both legs. Lena was the first to recover. She ran across the room and threw her arms around her brother. Anton teetered from the force of the hug. "Careful," Nona said. "Some of his ribs are cracked." "Sorry." Lena shifted her weight, leaning back to look at Anton. She burst into tears at the sight of him. Anton held her, letting her cry on his shoulder. I'm okay, Lena." He kissed her cheek, which made Lena cry harder. They held on to each other as though their lives depended on it. It was the single tenderest moment she'd ever seen the two siblings share. "What did those assholes do to you?" Lena sniffled, raising her eyes to take in Anton's battered face. When he didn't respond, she said, "Tate?" At the mention of his friend's name, Anton's face went blank. "He didn't make it," was all he said. Fresh tears spilled from Lena's eyes. Anton kissed her cheek one last time before releasing his sister. When he took a seat at the kitchen table, Nona placed a plate in front of him. It was mounded with enough spaghetti to feed 3 teenage boys. Anton dug into it with gusto. He spoke between bites. He didn't talk about what had happened to him and the Craigs. Instead, he told the story of a Russian compound overrun with a new type of zombie, a sentient zombie, the same type Lena's group had encountered. Nona didn't remind Anton not to talk with food in his mouth. As far as she was concerned, Anton had earned a break from table manners. "We're calling them sentients," Anton said. "Sentient zombies, super soldiers. Their compound was chaos when we left, because so many of them were turning." "It only reason we escape," Ka said, speaking for the first time. "How do we know you won't turn into a zombie?" Nona asked him. The sight of a Russian at the Chiquino table still had her hackles up. "I, a scientist," Ka said. "I work on Nijat vaccine. It's very dangerous." "You mean the Nejit virus is dangerous?" Amanda asked. "No, he means what he said." Anton inhaled another forkful of spaghetti. "The Nejit vaccine is dangerous. The Soviet soldiers are beginning to zombify, but they aren't like mutants and they aren't like regular zombies." He glanced at Kaz. "Explain it to them." "The vaccine have small amounts of the Nijat virus," Kaz said. "Taken over a long period of time," he shrugged. "You see what happens. They turn into smart zombies." "But what about you?" Nona asked. What's keeping you from turning into a zombie?" "I take saline, not vaccine," Ka said. "No one listened to me, but I know. I try to tell them to warn them, but no one will listen. I know better. I not take vaccine." He brought all his research with him, and something else. Anton's dead eyes swept the table. "Tell them, Kaz." The hulking Russian rose from the table. He really was the biggest man Nona had ever laid eyes on. He towered over the rest of them. He would make Leo and Bruce look normal-sized, if the boys were here. A metal briefcase sat on the hearth. It was the spot where Cassie liked to sit and play chess. Her little travel case with its miniature pieces and board leaned against the brick, right next to the black metal case. Kaz picked up the case. There was a combination code set into the top of it. He spun the dial and opened it. Inside was a thick stack of notebooks and paper. From what Nona could see, everything was written in Russian. There was also a microscope and several vials of a yellowish substance, all of them packed neatly into foam cutouts. "A microscope!" Amanda exclaimed. For some reason, the sight of it brightened her face. "My research." Kaz laid a giant hand on the stack of papers and notebooks. "We need to get Kaz and his research to Nellis in Nevada," Anton said. "He's agreed to help us fight the sentients in exchange for immunity. The sentients are more dangerous than anything we've come up against. They're as strong and fast as the mutants, but they think and reason just like us. And they eat brains. There are thousands of invaders all across the country. Imagine what will happen when they all begin to turn and hunger for brains." Silence fell as the statement sank in. "They're going to hunt us," Julie said. "Round us up and eat us like cattle." "Precisely my thought," Kaz rumbled. "This is why we must get to your scientists." Nona was skeptical. "And just how is that case supposed to help us combat sentient zombies? You helped create them. How is that information supposed to help our country?" "The zombies are a side effect," Kaz said. "They begin as a soldier program. My superiors wanted to make super soldier. So we work on virus to help men grow in strength and speed. But it not work. We make zombies like you see when we first come to United States. My superiors try to control the earliest zombies. We try to make them fight. We make a guess to put them to sleep between testing sessions. It knocked them out when they are not training." Nona finally understood where all this was going. "You have this gas formula?" "I have formula and samples." Kaz tapped the 3 test tubes in his case. "If we make more, we can put sentience down." Nona took a long drink from her glass, silently wishing it was whiskey instead of water. She didn't want to trust Kaz. The very sight of him made her want to spit like a feral cat. But if what he said was true, the future of their nation could be in his little black case. "Can you prove what you're saying?" she asked. "How do we know you're telling the truth?" Kaz frowned at her. "How can I show you? We need a zombie." "There are plenty of dead mutants outside," Anton said. "I need a sentient," Kaz replied. "I have samples." Amanda jumped out of her chair. She hurried over to the fridge and retrieved a Ziploc that appeared to contain bloody chunks of flesh. When Nona realized what it was, she narrowed her eyes. "You put that in my fridge?" Amanda flinched. "Sorry, I meant to tell you, but it was late and I forgot. She turned to Cause. I got some tissue samples, one from a mutant and one from a sentient. Is there a way to use these to show us what the gas does to zombies? Cause's eyes lit up. The eagerness in his expression was disturbing. Where you get these? From some zombies we killed. Amanda plunked the bloody contents onto the table in front of the Russian. This one is from a mutant. It's about 2 days old. I got this one from a sentient less than a day ago. You are a strange girl to be getting tissue samples from zombies. Cause peered at her. You like science? Biology is my favorite subject. Amanda grinned. There was something different about her. Nona had been too preoccupied with Anton and his Russian beast to notice before. Amanda seemed stronger, more confident. It was a good look on her. I was hoping to preserve these samples long enough to get my hands on a microscope, Amanda said. I thought maybe I could learn something useful. Yeah, she was going to try and convince everyone to go on a mission back to the high school and raid the science lab. Lena shook her head with affection. Anton, thanks for bringing us a microscope. I was not looking forward to going back into Bastopol. Anton didn't respond to his sister's easy banter. The dead look in his eyes broke Nona's heart. I can use this. Cause held up the plastic bag, his large hand nearly swallowing the tissue samples inside. The virus will still be active. It is? Lena leaned forward. How long does it stay active on a tissue sample? Back in Russia, the virus would survive over a week in a petri dish. Whoa! Amanda grabbed her chair, dragging it over beside Cause. I have to see this. Cause's face crinkled into a smile as Amanda pulled up beside him. Nona humphed and busied herself with clearing away the dirty dishes. It took Cause a few minutes to set up the microscope. Using a scalpel that came out of his metal briefcase, he removed a thin slice of skin from Amanda's pound of flesh. Look! Cause put the sample on a microscope slide. Amanda leaned forward eagerly, adjusting the microscope with the knob on the side. Whoa! I can see the virus. It's still moving in the tissue sample. I want to see. Julie elbowed Amanda out of the way. Oh, wow! That's disturbing. I wish Cassie were here to see this. Everyone took turns looking through the microscope. Everyone except Nona. She kept herself busy at the kitchen sink. She'd lived this long without seeing a zombie virus up close. No reason to change that now. This will not kill virus. Cause lifted one of the vials from its foam padding in the case. It will knock it out, like a sleeping gas. Back up, everyone. Is it safe for us? Nona asked, throwing open a window. It was designed for the virus, Cause said. We will be fine. Watch. To illustrate the point, he opened the vial. As soon as the liquid inside had contact with the air, it began to smoke. Small tendrils rose out of the bottle. Cause inhaled a few of the fumes, wrinkling his nose. Smells bad, but see? Harmless. He spread his arms wide to illustrate the point. Next, he bent over the table and let some of the gas drift over the tissue sample before returning the stopper. Look, he said to Amanda. She bent over the microscope. Oh, my God! You guys have to see this. The virus is slowing down. It's barely moving anymore. Wow, that was fast. Dormant, Cause said. Hibernation. Deep sleep. That is what gas does. Everyone jostled for a look, exclaiming over what they saw. Nona focused on scrubbing her spaghetti pot until it shone. As much as she hated to admit it, Anton had been right to bring the Russian beast here. He might hold the only legitimate key to battling the sentient zombies. She hated the idea of leaving Pole Mountain. But if the Russian had intel to help their country, there was no choice. They had to go to Nellis Air Force Base in Nevada. All of them. No one could sit this one out. There was just one problem. Leo hadn't come home yet. "This is all great," Lena said, "but no one has asked the real question. Just how are we supposed to get to Nellis in Nevada?" Anton shocked everyone by saying, "Kaz stole a tank. We drove it here from Rossi." "A tank?" Dal said. "How could you forget a little detail like that?" "Where the heck is it?" Lena said. "I didn't see any tank outside." "It's parked a half-mile down the road. I didn't want to give anyone a heart attack by driving into the clearing with a tank. It has food stored. Tate and I took out a supply truck on the way to Rossi. We loaded up on our way home. But there's something else I have to tell you." Anton's eyes took on a distant, glazed look. "Tate gave up our location. The only reason the Soviets aren't here is because they're fighting each other back in Rossi. But once the sentients have control, it's a good bet they'll come here. We have to leave." "What about Leo?" Lena asked. "We can't leave until he gets back." 2 days. Between drying the plates and putting the leftover pasta into a carton, Nona had reconciled herself to this. "We give Leo 2 days." "And if Leo isn't back in 2 days?" Anton asked. Nona forced herself to face her grandson. "If Leo isn't back in another 2 days, there's nothing any of us can do to help him. Our priority is getting Kaz and the formula to Nellis." Speaking those words was painful. It would have been easier to cut out her own heart. "What if the Russians show up here in the next 48 hours? Dal asked. "We keep a 24-hour watch." Nona braced herself for what had to be said next. "And we rig the cabin with explosives. I have the supplies needed to make tripwires. If the Soviets attack, we hide in the woods and let them think they have the upper hand. When they try to take the cabin, they'll be blown to pieces." You want to blow up the cabin?" Lena's eyes widened with disbelief. Nona ran her hand lovingly over the kitchen table. "I would rather see this place reduced to sawdust than let it fall into Soviet hands. Your grandfather built this with his own hands. It's what he would want." She left the others, striding outside with a dishpan of hot water. Julie followed her out. "Nona, are you okay?" Julie followed her down the front steps. "No reason to dump perfectly good hot water down the drain," Nona replied. "It's a good weed killer. This was a trick my mother taught me." Marching across the clearing, she dumped the scalding water on a thick patch of milkweed growing near the road. She took her time, waiting for Julie to go back inside with the others. She didn't. Nona tipped the wash basin, slowing the flow of water to buy herself a few precious moments of privacy. One grandson was missing. The other had lost his soul and his innocence in a Soviet torture chamber. There was a Russian in her home, and she had to choose between waiting for Leo and a mission to save the country. It was easier to kill weeds. The dishpan drained of the last of its water. When she turned around, Julie seized her in a hug. "We'll get through this, Nona." Nona patted Julie on the back, chest tight. The weight of the world was heavy, but she was not about to break. Nona Cecchino did not break. She straightened her spine. "There's work to be done. We need to gather supplies for our trip to Nellis. Do you still have your inventory sheet?" "Of course." "Good. Grab it. I'll meet you back here soon." "Where are you going?" "To get Anton. We need to get that tank moved up here so we can finish packing it for our trip to Nevada." Chapter 46. Weird. Amanda and Julie descended into the storage room, inventory sheet in hand. Nona had reviewed the inventory and put a check mark next to everything they would take with them in the tank. Top of the list was every last ounce of dried beans and rice they had. The room looked like a disaster zone. The old mare had done a number on it. She hadn't returned to the cabin since the mutant battle. Amanda made no comment on the mess. She had no interest in talking about zombie battle fallout. Not when she finally had Stevenson, Julie, alone. She closed the door and rounded on her friend. "How long have you known you're a girl?" Amanda demanded. Julie flinched. "We have a lot of work to do." "No way. You're not getting out of this conversation." Julie looked torn between wanting to bolt and wanting to hide underneath the machine guns that sat in a pile by her feet. Amanda saw the battle raging in her features, but she refused to back down. Julie visibly gathered herself. "I've known since I was a kid." "What?" Amanda's jaw dropped. "I've always been different." Julie shrugged. "You know that." "I just thought you were nerdier than me and Cassie." "Well, that's true, I am." She ran a hand through her hair. Her shaggy, dirty blonde hair actually looked feminine. "I've just never felt right in this body." "But—" Amanda searched for the right words. "How could you tell Nona before telling me and Cassie?" As soon as she spoke the words, she realized that's what had been bothering her. Seeing Stevenson, Julie, in girls' clothes hadn't seemed all that weird. Not once she had a few minutes to get used to the idea. But why had she chosen to tell Nona first? "It's a long story," Julie said. "But Nona already knew. I didn't have to tell her. She gave me these clothes." Her hands indicated the stylish clothes she now wore. "How did Nona know?" Amanda frowned. How could a little old lady from Italy know Stevenson was a girl in a boy's body? "You'll have to ask her," Julie said. It was clear she wasn't going to say more. Do you think I'm weird?" "Of course I think you're weird. You've always been weird." "So are you," Julie shot back. "That's why we're friends," Amanda said. "Friends forever, right? You, me, and Cassie. We're the chess nerds. We're as weird as they come." "Friends forever," Julie agreed. Her brow wrinkled. "Are you really mad at me for keeping it a secret?" "Not really. I've sort of kept a secret from you, too." Julie straightened, clearly intrigued. "What kind of secret?" "Watch this." Grinning, Amanda went over to a box of beans that sat on the floor. As Julie watched in wide-eyed surprise, Amanda squatted down and lifted the entire box in her arms. Julie's jaw sagged open. "Holy crap, Amanda! You're like a guy. I'm super strong." Amanda couldn't stop grinning. "I can't believe it took me so long to figure it out." She plopped the box back onto the floor. "I helped lift a big tree off Lena, and I moved a boulder to hide us from the Russians. I'm an Amazon." "Heck yeah, you are." Julie squeezed Amanda's biceps. "You could be a WWF wrestler." Maybe I will when the war is over. Not until you take a road trip across the country with me and Cassie, Julie said. Remember, we promised we'd do that together. They fell silent at the mention of Cassie. Do you think she's okay? Julie asked. Of course, Amanda said automatically. Leo will look after her. Uneasiness stretched between them. Neither of them said the obvious. Their friend should have been back by now. Julie cleared her throat. What do you think about the haircut? What's wrong with my hair? Amanda ran a hand through her straight brown locks. Nothing's wrong with it, but you're an Amazon. I think you should have an Amazonian haircut. What does that mean? Since when did you become a stylist? Please. I stole my mom's old copies of Cosmopolitan out of the trash and hid them under my bed. I read them at night when everyone was asleep. I know all about fashion. Amanda laughed. I have you beat. I stole my mom's romance books. I know more about sex than you. Who cares about sex when you have great hair? They looked at each other and burst out laughing. Fine, you can cut my hair, Amanda said. It would be fun to have a different cut anyway. But we'd better get moving. Nona will yell at us if we don't start moving the supplies. She bent down and picked up the giant box of dried beans. Julie jumped in front of her and opened the door. As Amanda walked by, she said, I'll bet by the time Cassie gets back from Luma Bridge, she'll know more about sex than both of us. Amanda knew she meant it as a joke, but it fell flat. She and Julie exchanged looks, silent worry for Cassie running between them.